What do you think of Giuliani's latest remarks heading into the trial?
Well, look, no, I'm not a constitutional scholar, and I would bet there's not many people who would accuse him of being a constitutional scholar. I don't buy it. Look, the Chief Justice is there not as Chief Justice. He's there because he is a Chief Justice, but not to do what a Chief Justice typically does. Here is to administer the Senate rules. If somebody wants to challenge the legitimacy of the impeachment proceedings, they would have to start off in like a district court, make an application, take it up to appeal, and maybe eventually the Supreme Court would take it. I mean, that's a ripeness issue. And him in his position, I don't think he's there to do that. And I don't think there's anything in the Senate rules that would support him doing. At the end of the day, if an application is made to dismiss, it goes to the Chief Justice. He wouldn't make that decision. Ultimately, the arbiter of that is the Senate. So what the Chief Justice is there to do is to really kind of preside over the circus and make sure that whatever rules they decide upon, they're followed.
So if that's pretty clear, has Rudy Giuliani forgot how the law works? Does he not care? What is going on?
If you can figure out what's going through his mind, then probably ought to get paid a lot more than you do.
I also want to ask you about the ongoing investigation at the Southern District. You have basically the contents now of his associate, Mr. Parnas's materials, his cell phone, WhatsApp messages, text messages, and images, interactions with individuals, all relevant to the impeachment inquiry going in. Do you think Rudy Giuliani has any potential exposure here when we're told he's under investigation? He's now began maligning his former colleagues in that office. He said they were, quote, Trump deranged, silly New York liberal idiots for looking at him at all.
I think those remarks are really offensive. But frankly, you know, being a prosecutor, being in that office, the skins are thick. And I don't think that's really going to move them one way or the other. But does he have exposure? Anybody under investigation, particularly that office, has exposure.
Do you think that he is freelancing? I mean, your view of him as a lawyer right now, he's still the criminal defense lawyer for the president. He's invoked that. We did a report last week about how he explained, well, he went back to Ukraine because it was so important to show that things that the president may have been accused of in the Mueller probe actually were other people's faults in Ukraine. And you thought, well, the Mueller probe is closed. It doesn't even always add up what he claims to be doing on his client's behalf.
I'd like to see his engagement letter with the president and wonder what the scope of his engagement is, because any lawyer who abides his ethical rules has an engagement letter, and it's really spelled out. So this seems to be a moving target, and it's really unclear what he represents him in. But, you know, look, there's a lot of facts out there that have yet to see the light of day on this investigation. So I think we're just going to have to wait and see. And as he goes off and says more and more things, if I was his lawyer and I had any control over him, I don't think any lawyer would counsel him to be out there saying the things he's saying.
Very interesting. David Kelly, former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Always good to see you, sir.
Thank you.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.